Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this at the PECB Anti-Bribery Conference for this panel. This panel is called Whistleblowing and Anti-Bribery, and you have one without the other. I'll be the moderator for today. My name is Ralph Al-Haddad. I'm based in Montreal, Canada. I work at SNC Lavalin, which is an engineering and construction company. My role in the company is Regional Head of Integrity for the US and Sector Integrity Officer for our nuclear sector of the company. I've been working in ethics and compliance for about 8 years now, in Montreal and in the aerospace industry as well. So I'll start by introducing our panelists, and we'll then address questions to our panelists, and we'll have a discussion on the questions that relate to whistleblowing and anti-bribery. So I'll start by introducing Maryse Tremblay. Maryse Tremblay is also based in Montreal. She's the director of the Global Ethics and Compliance Program at WSP Global Inc. And she's a leader also for the Montreal Integrity Network, which is a network formed of ethics and compliance professionals from different companies for companies based in Montreal. Second, we have Paul Townsend. Paul is a leader at Townsend Risk Advisory that specializes in anti-bribery and corruption compliance. Paul is based in Vancouver, Canada. We also have Carrie Keating, who's a senior managing partner at Steer LLC in the US. We also have Kenneth Jull, who's a counsel at Gardiner Roberts LLP Canada. And last but not least, we have John Boscariol, who's a partner in the litigation group at McCarthy Tétrault and is a leader of International Trade and Investment Law Group in Canada. So thank you for all the panelists for joining and for taking the time to have this discussion. So I will start with my first question, asking Maryse. Maryse, we'll start by addressing the question, which is the title of the panel today, anti-bribery and whistleblowing. Do you think that we can have one without the other?
Thank you, Raf. That's a really good question. In my opinion, yes, technically you could have both separately, but this is not what would be recommended. This is not what you should want. And there are multiple reasons for that. First of all, because I believe it needs to be part of a bigger anti-corruption, anti-bribery program. And because having a whistleblowing hotline on its own would mean that your employees would not necessarily know where to find it. They would not necessarily trust it. They would not necessarily trust the people who run it. And therefore would not necessarily come forward with their allegations through the hotline. So having an anti-bribery program that supports your hotline, or basically that has a hotline as a part of the program, is something that is recommended and which you should necessarily have in place. So as I mentioned, you would need to make sure that your employees know that the line exists, where to find it. They would need to trust the hotline, and they would need to trust that something will be done if they come forward with their allegations. They would need to trust that the confidentiality of their allegation and their identity is maintained, and that they can also come forward with their allegation while remaining anonymous if this is something that is offered through the hotline. And that they would need to trust that the people that are investigating also your allegations will conduct the investigation in an impartial manner, and that they, of course, will not be retaliated against. Because, of course, whenever you have a hotline in place, retaliation is one of the main fears that people have, and which often prevents them from coming forward with their allegations. Retaliation can come from anybody basically who's aware of the investigation process, whether it's the investigators, whether it's the people targeted by the allegations, whether it's the witnesses that are involved in the process, colleagues, your manager, anybody who's aware basically. And it's really important to protect the employees or whomever is coming forward with their allegations. So these are all things that an anti-bribery program would provide and which would help with the success of the hotline. So by having, again, your program in place, you would be able to raise awareness surrounding the hotline. You would be able to educate your employees as to what is bribery and how to detect it, because often people think they know what is bribery, but they don't necessarily are able to detect it whenever it's in front of them. So education, awareness is really important, and these are two aspects which will really help with the success of your whistleblowing, and which you wouldn't have if you just had a whistleblowing in place. And then you will need to build trust in your system. That comes with communication, tone from the top. So your managers need to lead by example, talking about the hotline, and also showing that whenever something's investigated, it's taken seriously, and yeah, that it's led in an impartial manner, of course. And then you have to, through the program, provide the framework that will allow you to manage the hotline efficiently, and that can translate into, for example, who's leading your hotline, who's managing it. Is it management? Is it someone independent? Does that person report to ultimately to higher management, or do they report to the board of directors if your company or organization has one? So independence is also really important in the way a hotline is managed, and will definitely have an impact on trust in the system and how the system is managed, how it's perceived by your employees, and how it's used ultimately. It's also recommended to have policies around your hotline, for example, an investigation policy, so that it's very clear for your employees how the process will unfold, what happens the second I report my allegation through the system, to what happens once it's investigated, and what measures will be taken, what measures can be taken by whom, and what will happen afterwards. What happens if I'm being retaliated against? Will that be taken seriously? Should I file another complaint through the system? So all of this needs to be detailed in a policy, or in a document somewhere, whether it's on your intranet or in an official document. And this will definitely have an impact on the awareness, on the trust in the system, and will, of course, again, have an impact on the success of your hotline. Also, just a quick comment. Often we are tempted to think that if you have the lesser complaints you have through your system, the better your company's doing. In my opinion, it's the other way around. So the more complaints you have through your hotline, the healthier your system is. It means that your employees are trusting the system. They feel comfortable coming forward. They know that something's going to be done, and yeah, it basically reflects the success of your hotline and of your program. Although it's a bit counterintuitive, but that's basically how it works. So I think that's it for me, Raf. I think that just covers broadly the points why you should have an anti-bribery program that supports your hotline, and that both cannot live without one another.
Thank you, Maryse. I fully agree with what you've said. I also think that having a strong ethics and compliance program is a much needed foundation for your whistleblowing program and your for all the measures to work properly. That's something that I definitely agree with. And on this note, I would ask a question now to Carrie. Carrie, what do you think are the key elements that are required to have an effective global whistleblower program for the prevention of bribery?
Thanks, Ralph. Well, I think Maurice just explained everything very well there. I too support the fact that trust and confidence is the key factor. If employees don't know how the process works, they're not inclined to take that risk to report. And I've worked for a Fortune 200 company that rolled out a hotline in 87 countries. And one of the things that I learned early on in that process is it's critically important to understand the cultural differences from one country to another. In certain cultures, it is not common to raise issues about your superiors. And in those particular situations, the trust and the confidence is critically important for the effectiveness of the whistleblower process. I think it's also important the training aspect. First, the company needs to really understand what are their bribery risks. What are they trying to ensure does get reported? In every company, those bribery risks are different. And the program of education about the whistleblower process should be built around those particular bribery risks. During the training, to provide practical examples that employees of that organization can understand and make sense to them. They can relate it to their day-to-day work. It's also very, very important to utilize the legal organization within the corporation so that there can also be a clear understanding of what the different laws are in each country where the whistleblower system is in operation. Particularly people sometimes do want to remain anonymous. Again, that shows a bit of a lack of trust, but it's a common approach. In certain countries, that's not allowed. You cannot make an anonymous allegation. The person that the allegation's been made against will have to be informed who made the allegation and what the allegation is. So those things need to be taken into consideration. Now, there's ways around helping someone stay anonymous if they want to, but still have the ability to have an ongoing dialogue with them. Because as probably we all know, that initial call to the whistleblower system is not going to give you everything you need to know to have a successful investigation. It'll make you aware that there's something in question in that location, but it's very, very important to be able to talk to the person and get more detail. So one of the ways to do that is to promote the use of an email that is made only for that person's reporting line. It's not their personal email or their company email. It can be any name at gmail.com, and that way you can communicate. You don't know who it is, but that person has a platform to continue their dialogue. If you have a whistleblower process that is telephonic, then the person that takes the call can tell the caller, here's the case number. We encourage you to call back in a week or two and get an update on how the company is approaching your particular concern. That way, the company has an opportunity to communicate with the intake person on the hotline calls. And if there are additional questions, those can be presented to the caller when they call in and identify the case number associated with it. Also, it's very important to make sure that the communications that go out are going out in the local languages, and that the folks have the ability to report their issues in their local language so that they can communicate more effectively and get their point across. I've learned when folks try to give examples of their allegation in a language that they don't speak, sometimes that concern is either dramatically understated or overstated, depending on their comfort level with the language they're speaking in. And it's also important as you go forward to look at lessons learned. If you've been able to validate the allegation and appropriate steps were taken after investigation, it's important to find out, well, what happened and why did it happen? Did we have a lack of controls? Did we have missing controls? What can we do now to learn from this experience and look to protect the company going forward? And it's also important to get out to management that could have a similar issue, and without giving names of those involved, just educate them on this is what happened and this is what you need to look for, and here's a good example of what can go wrong. So in my opinion, those are the key elements: continued reinforcement, I'm sorry, of the whistleblower process, make sure employees know how it works, and then over time, you'll see the calls increase. As Marcy's said, the fact that you don't have calls doesn't mean you have a successful whistleblower program. It means you don't. And the more calls you have, and you investigate and find out there just may be a lack of complete knowledge of how a particular process was working, and it's important to communicate those findings back to the caller if you're able to do that, and tell them, hey, look, we've looked at it, this is what we found. Give them the opportunity to comment, or even, hopefully to accept the fact that there was no issue, and now upon knowing more about the situation, they agree that there's nothing particularly wrong there. So that's important too, and that'll gain the trust and confidence, and then you should see the whistleblower process really protecting the company on which it was designed to do.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you. I really like what you said about trust and culture, and I really do think it's important in the company that employees feel like they trust the whistleblowing process, and that there is that speak up culture, which ties in very well to what Marie said, that the more complaints you have sometimes is better, because it means that people are comfortable speaking up, and there's this transparency culture in the company. And it definitely, we all know through our jobs that it's not easy to be someone who submits a complaint, or to be a whistleblower, because you might feel like it's you're alone, and it's sometimes scary. So on this note, my next question is to Kenneth. Kenneth, what do you think are the incentives for someone to be a whistleblower in a company?
That's a great question. Some people take the position that whistleblowers should be whistleblowers by simply doing the right thing, that they ought not, for example, to be paid to be a whistleblower. And one of the controversies is, should we pay, for example, should governments pay whistleblowers to come forward? I'm of the view that compensation and payment of whistleblowers is very important. And why I say that is, and I've represented whistleblowers, and you have to appreciate the position that they're in. They literally are putting their entire career, not just their job, they're putting their career on the line. They have to explain to their spouse and friends what's happening. They will experience, if it's discovered that they are the whistleblower, or even if it's suspected that they are the whistleblower, they will be isolated. Others will circle the wagons. All of a sudden, they'll be cut out of work. People won't talk to them. So it's a very daunting experience. And I'm very much in the belief of compensation as an incentive. And let me just give you an example. I teach at the University of Toronto in the law school, a course called Financial Crimes and Corporate Compliance. Now, one of the questions that always arises when you're teaching is when you're teaching ethics, students will say, they'll raise their hand, they'll say, Professor, is this on the exam? And the reality is, if you say, no, this is not on the exam, but I think you really need to study this, it's important. The fact is, as important as ethics are, students are competitive with each other. And the competitive world that we live in, they will do a risk analysis. And their risk analysis will be, I'm competing with these other people. I want an A or whatever the mark is. And if they're not reading the ethics, then I'm not going to read the ethics. So if you want to motivate students to study ethics, you have to compensate them. And so that's really important. And so we see in the whistleblower context a number of different programs for compensation. In the United States, it's very fulsome. In Ontario and in Canada, where I am, we're starting. Some provinces have it, some don't. Ralph, in Quebec, you don't have it actually, paid whistleblower programs, but in Ontario we do. But I want to make one larger link, and that is, so if we should pay people for blowing the whistle, I want to stand back and make a larger point about compensation in general. And the point that I want to make is that, and I've written about this, that why do we wait for a bad thing to happen to compensate people? In other words, should we not be thinking, certainly within organizations, about methods of compensating people for compliant behavior? Why are we not paying people for just simply either being compliant or even potentially coming forward internally to make a whistleblower complaint? Now, this is a very interesting thing from a cultural point of view, because in North America, it is not traditionally, it hasn't been traditionally the norm to compensate for compliance. The DOJ in the United States has now said that they will recognize compensation as part of a recognition of a compliance system. So that's starting to change. But it is somewhat novel. Now, I'd be really interested to hear people from this session talk about this, because my understanding is in Europe, and particularly in countries like Norway and Finland, it is much more the norm to compensate people in a more holistic way and compensate them for being compliant. And that, I think, is extremely important. If you're within your organization, if you feel that your organization will reward you for being compliant, and that's a tough thing, because sometimes, I'll just close on this, it's easy to say, compliance is something to say, it's easy to say, but when it comes down, let's talk about what's really involved in being compliant. It sometimes involves turning a deal down. It sometimes involves red flagging something and saying, you know what, I don't think we should do this. This is too risky. And guess what? Your stock options may suffer, your pay may suffer, you may not be in the division that's leading because you turned something down. That may have a cost. And if your company says to you, you know what, we're still going to compensate you for doing the right thing, for being an ethical person, so don't worry about that, you'll do fine, then I think you're going to see much higher levels of compliance. If, on the other hand, the company's attitude is, well, you should be compliant, but you know what, your numbers aren't that good this year, so too bad, then I think that is a culture that we shouldn't be encouraging. So I'll just stop there, and I'm really interested to hear other people's comments on this.
Thank you, Kenneth. I totally agree. I mean, I think by nature it's very hard to be a whistleblower, because most whistleblowers in their mind, they're taking a risk. Like you said, it's not just with their job, it's with their career. They're taking a risk because they're doing the right thing. So having some sort of a compensation or a reward would sort of maybe neutralize the risk that they are taking, or would act as some sort of compensation for the risk that they are taking. And we do need people like that in general. You want people to speak up, to stand up for what's right, and you can't fault them for finding it too difficult and then eventually not standing up for what's right. So by offering incentives and by offering compensation and rewarding ethical behavior, I think you would encourage people to do that, and you would have your program go into the right direction. Also, so on this note, we reckon that for companies, it's not I guess cheap to have a compliance program, and we know that a lot of companies, the profit is their top of mind. So it's all about cost and money. So my next question would be to Paul. Paul, we all recognize that investing in building and manning a hotline is not cheap. So how can you convince management that this cost is worthwhile? And would you be able to highlight some of the key benefits to an organization and to management for implementing an effective whistleblower hotline?
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. I think this is such an important question for all organizations, because I've seen so many cases where it becomes a tick the box exercise, and it's because companies don't, really think about what are all the benefits of a whistleblower hotline and what are all the benefits of an anti-bribery and corruption program. And so they, they set up a policy, they outsource the hotline, and they buy an out of the box training program, and they say, check, we're done. I think, as Carrie talked about, it's so important to start with a risk assessment of your organization, because if you don't understand the risks, you don't really understand the flip side of that, which is your benefits. And so that's really important. One of the things that I use with all my clients is I go through, and if you don't have this, pick it up. DOJ, SEC's hallmarks of an effective compliance program is so important to do a gap analysis, because again, if you don't understand where you're missing the mark and where your gaps are, you won't also see what are all the benefits of putting these things in place. And one of the hallmarks is actually incentives. So, to Kenneth's point, it's so critical to build in incentives in your organization, and it doesn't have to be just paid money. It can be things like promotional opportunities, larger bonus perhaps, meeting with the president, being called out for having strong ethics in your organization, training your team, all those kinds of things. You can find inventive ways to incentivize your employees, but it is so critical. But in terms of understanding some of the benefits, I think the first thing you have to, if you're the compliance person and you're trying to present this to management, senior management, so they can understand the benefits, I think the first thing you have to do is present them with hard data. And the hard data is so clear. For example, 43% of all frauds are detected by a tip, and a third of those come from outside your organization. So I always tell clients, listen, you can't just communicate this to staff, you have to communicate it out of your organization. When I was at TK Corporation and manned the hotline for 16 years, we had some of our best tip-offs come from vendors and customers. And it was so critical, and it really helped our organization by making sure that we communicated it outside of the organization. The other stat is that on average, organizations with a hotline as an internal control see a 50% reduction in the number of frauds and a third reduction in the duration of frauds. So those numbers are very compelling. I would say another key benefit, and especially these days, and you're seeing this more and more, with ESG becoming front and center, I'm seeing a lot of the banks saying that if you don't have a proper ABC program, including an effective hotline in your organization, we might not fund you. And so that's hitting you right in the pocketbook. So it's really critical these days for organizations to be seen as leaders on ESG, and part of that governance piece is having an effective hotline. I think the third thing that I'd say, and from my experience, I'd even say this is one of these intangibles that I'd say is almost one of the most important, is that it vastly improves two-way communication in your organization. Typically, most communication we see in an organization is from the top down. It's, the executive team saying, hey, we need to do this, we need to be, good at ethics and etc. But if you've got a really effective whistleblower hotline, it vastly improves your two-way communication, and it tells people that are working on the front lines that, hey, your views are important and we really want to hear from you. And when I say that, I mean you have to have an effective hotline. And What that means is that your senior executive team is out there telling people that they really want to hear from them. So one of the things, just as an example, one of the things I did is when I went around to every office around the world and talked about the hotline and good ethics, I would make sure that the highest ranking person in that office started off the talk and talked about how critical this was to the operations. And you could just see that everyone in the room was like, oh man, if this guy's saying this is important, I better stand up and take notice. And then we also gave examples of, hey, listen, this person, and we didn't name names if they wanted to stay anonymous, but a person gave us a tip on this particular item. We were able to investigate it, prosecute them or deal with them or fire them, and this is the result. So please, we take this stuff seriously, and we show that we take it seriously. If we get a call, we respond to it within a week. At the outside. Sometimes I would jump on a plane the next day sometimes if it was a really serious thing. So I think those are some of the reasons why it's such a benefit to an organization to have an effective whistleblower hotline to support your ABC program.
Thank you, Paul. I definitely agree, and we've seen historically companies adopting ethics and compliance program, and all of a sudden wanting to spend that much amount of money to build a program. Historically, it would happen because a company would be reacting to some sort of issue that happened. However, what you brought a very good point is that nowadays, when it comes to ESG, it's not just a thing to react about. It's something very important to have, because people are becoming much more savvy on the impact of corporations on society and on the environment. So if someone wants to work at a company or invest in a company or do business with a company, you would want to know that they have they have the right things when it comes to ESG. They have the right tone from the top, and you see that very visibly when a company from its executives are really spearheading initiatives related to ESG. So my next question will be to John. So John, you've done all the right things in creating a workable whistleblower program. So what are the next things that a company needs to do after it has been flagged with a anti-corruption violation, or if something happens? What can a company do next?
Yeah, thank you, Ralph, and thanks for all the panelists for their great, insightful comments up to now. And I want to bring this kind of full circle now, because we started with Maryse asking that question, can you have one without the other? And I do think that once you've got the information and you think there's a potential violation, there's other important things that now need to happen to take advantage of that situation and to deal with that situation. I did want to pick up on a couple of things that Paul and Carrie raised. In particular, this point about, if you're not worried about enforcement, even if you're not convinced it's the right thing to do, or this is an important competitive advantage for your organization, I can tell you, companies out there, whether it's banks doing financings, whether it's underwriters supporting IPOs, whether it's private equity that are looking at a potential acquisition, or if you're a junior in the mining industry and a senior might be acquiring you, all of them are asking questions about anti-corruption compliance. This is a new form, I'd say, in the last 5 to 10 years. This has really impacted not just US companies, but Canadian companies and others around the world, where we have this new form of private enforcement. So even if you ignore everything else we're saying, the market is going to force you into this position if you truly want to have a strong organization that is commercially attractive to do business with. And a really important point there is this what we're seeing with a lot of the investigations and due diligence work we do, is a lot of targets seem to have just adopted paper policies, particularly around the whistleblowing element. And Paula talked about the importance of having that hotline. And Kerry in particular, I liked his comments about how there has to be a communication process. It's just not a one-way communication where you receive a communication and then you don't know what to do with it. You can't get more information. You can't update the whistleblower on progress. And we've seen that a number of times in investigations where the system wasn't properly designed. They didn't do that risk assessment Paula talked about, and the company or the board just received a single message from a whistleblower saying X had happened, and it was an anonymous email. And there was no more opportunity to follow up with them. And the whistleblower obviously wasn't approached because she was anonymous, and it then just spiraled out of control where the whistleblower felt that her concerns weren't being dealt with, and she went externally to report to enforcement authorities. So I think it's so important to actually think very carefully about what you're going to do once you get that communication, and have a mechanism in place, obviously beforehand, to address that. But to jump into the bigger picture now and kind of look at this a bit more holistically, if you look at the statistics, the uncovering corrupt activities by companies, the biggest, by far, the biggest factor in that is the companies self-disclosing that. And that self-disclosure is, you can argue, good for not just the company, but for many others to understand what enforcement authorities are looking for in terms of anti-corruption compliance. And if you take a look at the OECD Anti-Bribery Group has been studying some of these disclosures, and one of the leading reasons for these disclosures is an initial whistleblower report. So these things are tied in very tightly with one another, having an effective whistleblower program, but then also having the measures in place where a company can then properly disclose and get credit for disclosing voluntarily to enforcement authorities. And unfortunately for a lot of you in the audience and for us here in Canada, we don't have a regime yet that provides for such disclosure opportunities, a formal disclosure regime like you have in the United States. It's particularly challenging in some jurisdictions like Canada, where the only means of punishing foreign corruption violations is criminal. And that means that a company needs to be convicted in order to pay a fine or a penalty for foreign corruption. In the United States and in the UK, we're seeing more in the UK now, but certainly in the United States, a very well-developed regime of deferred prosecution agreements and voluntary disclosure processes that you can follow to get some assurance that there's going to be benefit if you come forward. In Canada, we have a brand new remediation agreement regime, which is similar to the deferred prosecution agreement regime. It allows you to come forward, disclose, do a mea culpa, disclose and negotiate a resolution that sees the payment of a fine, that sees the company undertaking remedial measures, potentially being subject to audit over a 3-year period or probationary period, but does not get criminally convicted. Unfortunately, that remediation agreement regime has gotten really bad press in Canada based on recent developments at the political level here. And not a lot of companies here are looking favorably upon that regime. And if you ask our RCMP about it, they'll tell you there are 1 or 2 companies that are in the pipeline now, but we have had no one use that regime. And so for those of you that are dealing with this issue in multiple jurisdictions, understanding Canada and some of these other jurisdictions were not as advanced as the United States or the UK in having these. So that will be a challenge as you move forward. So just something to keep in mind. Certainly, if your disclosures are going to involve the United States, we know the US discusses issues with Canadian authorities and UK authorities, so that will force a disclosure possibly on the Canadian side. But that's something to keep in mind when you now deal with information you've received from a whistleblower report. In certain circumstances in Canada, it may be completely acceptable for you to just take that information, fix your problem, remediate internally, and move forward. But ideally, when we all look at this from a holistic point of view and we look at the policy around trying to shut down foreign corruption, it would be good if our enforcement authorities could have more reliable programs for voluntary disclosures and remediation agreements. So I'll stop it there, Ralph, and we can start with questions.
John, thank you so much for your insight.
Hey, can I just add on?
Yes, of course, of course.
Yeah, sorry, John, that was excellent. And it just made me think about another benefit of the whistleblower hotline is actually, and one of the reasons that we tried to make it as effective as possible in the organization I was in, was that you don't want people going externally. You'd rather have them come to your internal hotline rather than, to the authorities. And so that's a big benefit, because the last thing you want is, this either going to media or going to government who's going to come in and maybe fine you and put monitors in place. You want to deal with it internally. And so that's another big benefit that you could put forward to your executive team.
That's very true. It's always more effective for a company to first deal with any potential wrongdoing on its own, and then self-disclose to the government rather than having being caught by surprise. So so thanks for your input, Paul. I do have questions from the audience. So I'll start with the first question that I'll ask to the whole panel. So how can we know that the whistleblowing is implemented effectively, and what would be the relevant key performance indicator for the whistleblowing program? So how can how can we have a KPI to tell us that our whistleblowing program is working well?
I can start if you want.
Let's go ahead.
I think you can always turn to benchmarks. There are many benchmarks out there from different organizations, whether it's NAVEX, for example. They are mostly companies that provide whistleblowing hotline services, and they also publish yearly their benchmark. And that's what we use in our organization, is to compare the number of reports we get per quarter per number of employees, times, well, depending on the benchmark and the ratio, it's either times 100 or times 1,000. So basically, number of reports you get divided by your number of employees times 100 or 1,000, depending on the benchmark, and that gives you a good idea of where you're at and where you should be aiming to.
If I could also add on to this one, I also think when you're looking at the effectiveness of your process in general, what I touched on briefly when I spoke earlier, if you have a complete process that takes it from the allegation to substantiation to remedial actions, you shouldn't see that, and then you educate, as I say, management on what went wrong, tighten controls, you shouldn't see that repeating itself. If you see certain issues, particularly in one country or one physical location of the corporation, I think that shows that you haven't quite finished the loop. And it's important to know what went wrong, but once you know what's gone wrong, it's important to try to keep it from happening again.
I'll add a comment in there too, Ralph. I think you need to look at also what kind of things are coming in through the hotline. You need to look at, are they coming in, consistently from all your geographies and from all your different areas? And also, what type of things are coming in. This will give you an idea of, have you communicated it effectively? Because if you've got one region over another coming in, you might not have been communicating effectively across the board. And if you're having certain things come into the hotline that are inappropriate for a hotline, you haven't done a good job communicating it. So I think you really need to sift through the data and get a really good understanding of what's coming through, because it may indicate where you've got gaps in your communication.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Paul. So it's not just the quantity of your complaints and the reports that you receive, but also the quality, and you want to make sure that your whistleblowing program is equally effective and used properly all across the board in all of the regions of your company. Thanks, everyone. So I'll move on to the next question that we have from the audience. So the question is, do you believe that having a hotline for employees to be able to anonymously report breaches should be a requirement in the whistleblowing procedure to prevent the possibility of victimization? Meaning, should all whistleblower or reporting lines, should they all be anonymous, or should we? Is it okay to leave it to the discretion of the reporter for it to not be anonymous?
Well, I'll talk again if you don't mind.
Of course.
I think the anonymous factor, again, in some countries it's required. I think for a good and effective whistleblower process, it should always be allowed, perhaps not overly encouraged, but particularly when the whistleblower process is new to the organization. Until it becomes a more trusted mechanism, you'll probably get more anonymous calls than you will folks identify themselves. But as I said earlier, too, if you have the mechanisms in place that allow someone to stay anonymous but still be able to engage in conversation, you kind of have the best of both worlds then. But yeah, I think it's important to always allow for anonymous, because the bottom line is you want to hear it regardless. And if that's the only way the person feels comfortable, then you just have to have a good process in place to make the most out of that communication ability.
Yeah, I was just going to add, we've seen some resistance sometimes from companies about having anonymous reporting, and there's this idea that it will encourage false reports or vindictive reports or reports that aren't based on reality. I do think that's just the price you're going to pay. The idea is to maximize the opportunity for these reports to be made. And I can tell you, enforcement authorities, if they see that you don't have an anonymous option, will look very negatively upon your policy. You want to maximize it, and maybe it does encourage some false reports, but that's part of the compliance function, is to weed through these things and figure this out. That shouldn't be a reason for not having anonymous reporting.
Maybe I'll just jump in just to add that if you're interested in this, a really interesting case study is Enron. And there's a great book written by the whistleblower, Sherry Watkins, called Power Failure. And in that, she talked about the fact that her first memo was anonymous, and it was ignored. And it was only after she ultimately put her name to it that the folks at Enron took notice. And by then, it was too late, and the stock had plummeted to almost zero. So I think it's anybody interested in this, it's interesting to see how this actually cashes out in practice. And I would recommend case studies like Enron to help us understand the dynamics that are going on here.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I agree with everything that's been said. As somebody who's kind of manned and investigated a hotline for many years, we often found that for us investigating it was always better when the person wasn't anonymous, because then we could follow up with them and ask questions, and often those were the by far the most effective investigations. But the anonymous, like what was said earlier, I mean, you have to have it, and it's so critical to have that ability, because in our organization we had a lot of seafarers from cultures like the Philippines, where they're just not used to standing up and blowing the whistle, and they're very afraid of repercussions against them. And so the anonymous hotline for that culture was critical, because it gave them an avenue to make complaints. And but we had to do a lot of work in assuring them that it wasn't going to come back to them.
Thank you. These are all very good points, and this is definitely something very interesting, because while I definitely agree that there always should be the option for a whistleblower to stay anonymous for their own for their own peace of mind, and for the investigation process to be effective. It's very useful that the complainant remains anonymous, because a lot of the times we see pushback from the business, and the first thing they ask is that, oh well, I want to know who submitted that complaint, and this defeats the whole purpose. So I do think it's extremely important to have the whistleblower remain anonymous. However, on the flip side, this ties into the next question that I see here on the screen. How can you prevent misuse of a whistleblower hotline or email that is, that has fake information that is intentionally brought forward, considering anonymity? So basically, how do you deal with complaints that are made in bad faith?
I think I would jump in on that. One of the keys here is having a robust internal investigation, as Paul's talked about. If folks know that any whistleblower will lead to a robust, appropriate, thorough internal investigation, I can assure you, having done them myself, that will root out false claims. I mean, you will look at the data, you will look at the documents, you will look at whether or not there's any substance. And I think that that will be a good safeguard against the potential for it being abused and the potential for it being used improperly.
Yeah, I mean, for example, at SNC Lavalin, we have a non-retaliation policy, meaning the company's management cannot retaliate against someone who blows the whistle in good faith, and we do have a sort of a definition for the term good faith, meaning that if you believe that there's genuinely a problem, and you're submitting a complaint to report that problem, regardless of the results of the investigation, whether it turns out to be founded or not, the company's management is not allowed to retaliate against you, because you submitted that complaint in good faith. However, submitting a complaint in bad faith, meaning that, for example, you have a personal problem with someone in the company, you sit on a desk next to someone who let's say annoys you, and you want to hurt them in some way, so you submit a complaint using the whistleblower system. This would be considered a complaint in bad faith, and any complaint made in bad faith would not would potentially have some consequences to the employee, because they're using the system that is meant to prevent wrongdoing and to protect the company. The system is then being used to hurt others, which is not the point. So I think compliance functions in general would easily be able to point out a complaint made in bad faith, and in any case, the ensuing investigation would show if the complaint was made in bad faith or not. So another question that we have from the audience is, many people don't want to blow the whistle through the whistleblowing system because they don't believe in that the compliance function will keep this information confidentially. So how can we improve this process? And I guess, how can we let people know that they can trust the system, and that this report that they submitted will be treated confidentially?
Yeah, I'll comment.
I can jump in on that one, Ralph.
Sure.
Sorry, Gary, I'll jump in first. I'll pass it over quickly too. I was just going to say that one of the things that I recommend to the companies that I work with is that if there's any concern about this whatsoever in the organization, that you use a third-party provider. And I'm not saying that because they're necessarily better or anything like that, or that you don't have good internal resources, but it's just giving that assurance to people in the organization and outside of the organization that their anonymity is going to be protected. And it's so much easier to say that if it's going to a third party than
Sorry, Paul, your
yeah,
voice was cutting a little bit. We didn't get that last
to
bit.
say, oh, we're going to keep your name anonymous. We'll keep so if there's not that, high confidential, trust us, and perhaps in the organization of trust, or you haven't earned. I'll pass it over to you, Kerry.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, one of the things I found in the company I was describing earlier, that we rolled out a global whistleblower process, is part of the investigations process. And I believe also third party is a great way to go, but at the very least have a dedicated function internally within the company that is not a part of any of the business lines, that operates completely independently, most likely through the legal and compliance function. And what this company did is they developed a very stringent process to do the investigations, and that included, at every time they spoke to a whistleblower, and of course these are in person, this example, they signed a confidentiality agreement. And the purpose of that was to explain to the employee, we're not going to tell your management who you are and that you are the whistleblower. This is our promise to you. But in return, and we saw this happen a number of times, the whistleblower blows themselves in. They have a meeting with investigators. They think it went pretty well. They think the people responsible are perhaps going to face some consequences. So they start telling their coworkers that they were the ones that blew the whistle. Well, that undermines the process. It makes the conclusion of the investigation that much harder. So we kind of look at it as a two-way street. Now, there's certain countries, the legality of that can be challenged, but again, it's part of that education process to employees that the company takes seriously protecting you as a whistleblower, but it's a two-way street. You have to protect yourself also.
Yeah,
That's
if I may,
yeah,
if I
go
may add, it's also about making sure that you're a bit like what Kerry was saying, make sure that your process is standardized across the regions, across your offices, and that will ultimately show your employees that you're taking it seriously, and that whatever the allegations are about, it's going to be treated the same way, and not be influenced by any factors that are external or internal to the investigation process, I think.
I agree. I've seen situations where the whistleblower chose to remain anonymous, and through the ensuing investigation, the people involved in the investigation would end up figuring out who the whistleblower is, because sometimes a case would occur in a small group of the company, and the report that comes out of the whistleblowing complaint would have some indication as to who would be the person that submitted that complaint. However, I've not seen in my experience where an investigation was completely derailed because the whistleblower was not anonymous anymore, and I've not seen any situations where, by the whistleblower not being anonymous, they've suffered some consequences. For example, in cases that I've seen in the past, We've even had whistleblowers that chose not to remain anonymous because they wanted the rest to know that they were the ones that submitted that complaint. So I think the major role would be on the company to make sure that they protect the person who submits the complaint, whether that complaint was made anonymously or not. All right, so I see we have 1 more minute left, and I have one more question here. Perhaps we can address it quickly. Who in the organization should manage the whistleblower hotline?
I think it depends on the size of your organization and on your budget, whether you have a compliance team or not. Ideally, there should be an independence in the team that manages the hotline. Ideally, they would have reporting line directly to the board of directors. That's in my opinion.
I totally agree. I think the purpose of having a robust reporting line would be that that whatever comes through it would be seen through completely unbiased eyes, and usually these would be your ethics and compliance departments that would report to your chief compliance officer, who reports to the board of directors, or it would be your corporate HR function that does not belong or reports under a certain business unit of the company. So ideally, it should be as impartial as possible. The function that should be, managing the whistleblower line should be as impartial as possible. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for all the panelists for taking the time today and for answering all these questions. Thank you for the attendees for showing up, and thank you for PCB for organizing this panel. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.